Is there anywhere that the cluster approach is already being used at the moment?
We started using the cluster approach in the Congo, in Uganda, Liberia, and Somalia. These were the first countries where we rolled out the new cluster approach. Since then, we've also used the cluster approach in a number of new emergencies. For example, in the response to the earthquake in Pakistan, in Yogyakarta in Indonesia, in Philippines in response to a typhoon there. We've also used it in Mozambique, in Madagascar, and recently in the Dominican Republic. I may have forgotten one or two, but we've used it in a number of new emergencies which are being caused by cyclones or earthquakes, other disasters.
And has it worked?
Yes. We recently had an independent evaluation of the first 2 years of the experience of using the cluster approach. And this evaluation has shown that there are a number of areas that we still need to provide more guidance on, where we need to further develop the policy, where we need to make some improvements. But overall, this evaluation has shown that in all of the countries that were studied, the general feeling is that the cluster approach does add value, that the responses have been better in those countries, that there's been better attention to the gap areas that were there in the past, that there's been better partnership between the UN and UN humanitarian actors. So overall, the verdict is, in the countries where we've used the cluster approach so far, we're seeing a lot of improvement. We still have some detractors, but it's interesting that in this evaluation, of the 400 people who were interviewed in a survey, because many others were interviewed as well, hundreds more were interviewed in a more detailed way, but in a survey that was done, only 8% of those surveyed said that they did not think the cluster approach was the right way to go. Others felt that even if there were problems, they still felt that the cluster approach was better than what we had before.
Are you going to try to address some of those issues?
We have to address those issues. There are still a number of problems that we need to address. For example, the whole question of activation of the cluster approach. There's confusion about what does activation mean.
And what does activation mean?
I think it's a flawed concept. In fact, at the global level, we have already activated the cluster approach. We have it at the global level. What we want to see now is that in all new emergencies, this new capacity will be used where it's needed in order to avoid unnecessary gaps, in order to ensure proper accountability and better response. At the country level, what we need to do is to ensure that in all the existing emergencies and in all emergencies in the future, that we formalize the arrangements that we have for response. We need to be clear about what are the main sectors for this particular operation and who is the lead for each of these sections. Sometimes that's called activation. I think a better term is formalization. We need to have some process for being clear about who is the lead in each of these different sectors. So we now have some new operational guidance on designating sector or cluster leads in major new emergencies. But the operational guidance is not on activating the cluster approach, it's on how to designate these leads. Because we want to get to the point where this simply becomes the way we do business in all emergencies. We should not have to activate it or deactivate it. It should become simply the way we work.
Is the cluster approach now completely activated at the global level?
Yes. For a number of sectors, we now have clearly designated new lead agencies. For example, for water and sanitation, UNICEF is now the global lead. For emergency shelter in natural disasters, it's the Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies. for emergency shelter in conflict situations, it's the UN Refugee Agency, UNHCR. So we have these new arrangements in a number of different sectors at the global level. There may still be some changes in the future, so I don't want to say that it's fixed for the next 100 years, but yes, we now have a new system which should not require so much further adjustment at the global level.
So we have these global cluster leaders. What are their responsibilities?
Their responsibilities are in three main areas. First of all, on the standard setting policy side, they're responsible for ensuring that all their partners are familiar with the international standards and agreed convention or international law relating to that particular sector. If there are any new policies relating to that sector, they're responsible for endorsing or developing these policies and for disseminating them and ensuring that their partners are aware of these. The second area of responsibility is that of building up stockpiles, or at least having databases of what is available at the global or regional level, what can be called on in new emergencies. So stockpiles such as tents or blankets or food or other emergency supplies that may be needed, and also for developing the necessary rosters of staff who can be deployed in emergencies. And the third category is that of providing operational support in emergencies. This may involve helping with resource mobilization, advocacy, emergency preparedness, other kinds of operational support in emergencies.
Is there a risk that this could just become an exercise in rules and policies and bits of paper rather than any practical change?
There's always a risk that we get too bureaucratic in this process, and we have to try to not fall into that trap. The cluster approach was criticized early on for involving far too many meetings and too much paperwork. The cluster approach itself does not call for meetings. It calls for appropriate coordination, and it's the responsibility of cluster leads and of cluster partners to ensure that appropriate coordination arrangements are put in place. That does not mean having one meeting every week for every single sector in every town in every country. It's about putting in place the appropriate mechanisms. And likewise with paperwork, in the UN we're good at producing paper. We produce far too much paper. It's not about producing lots of policies. It's about producing useful policies, concrete policies, practical policies, the right ones to help us work efficiently, effectively in emergencies.
So you said that this is now activated at the global level, but what's happening at the country level?
At the country level, we would like to see a lot of flexibility in the way the response is organized. It depends on who has capacity on the ground in each particular country. Sometimes you've got organizations that have been there for many years. They know the local situation very well, and they're well placed to lead the response in that particular country. So it's not always essential that you replicate the arrangements that you have at the global level at the country level.
So who will decide who's going to be the country cluster head?
The humanitarian country team, that's the different humanitarian actors, will work out themselves who they believe are best placed to lead each of the sectors. They'll work out which sectors are appropriate for that particular response, and they will then just ensure that there are no objections to that from the global cluster leads, because we have to ensure that in all situations the global cluster leads are satisfied with the arrangements that are in place at the country level so that they can provide the necessary support and so that they can basically continue supporting those arrangements as appropriate at the country level.